I thought buying a house meant freedom until the HOA showed up at my door with a citation for my mailbox being the wrong shade of beige. Sarah Martinez had worked 3 jobs for 7 years to save for that down payment. She dreamed of painting her front door red, maybe planting sunflowers in the yard, finally having a place where no landlord could tell her what to do. But standing in her driveway at 6 in the morning, holding a violation notice for her garden gnome being aesthetically inappropriate, she realized the American dream came with fine print nobody had mentioned. The woman handing her the citation wore a clipboard like a badge of authority and spoke with the tone of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. What Sarah didn't know was that this same woman had just destroyed 3 families on the same street, foreclosed on a veteran's home over a lawn dispute, and was methodically targeting single mothers who seemed least likely to fight back. The fines would escalate. The harassment would intensify. The community would watch in silence as another family disappeared. But what the HOA compliance officer didn't realize was that Sarah Martinez had spent 15 years working in a school district's administrative office, where she'd learned to read legal documents, navigate bureaucracy, and most importantly, how to research public records. And when she finally discovered what was really happening in her perfect suburban neighborhood, the woman with the clipboard would face something she'd never encountered before, someone who'd done their homework. Welcome to the Human Stories, where we explore the moments that define us when the world seems designed to break us down. Before we continue with Sarah's story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day because of viewers like you who believe that every person's struggle deserves to be understood. Thank you for being part of this community. The house was everything Sarah had imagined during those long nights cleaning office buildings after her day job at the school district. A modest 2-story colonial with white shutters and a small front yard in Maplewood Heights, a planned community 40 minutes outside the city. The realtor had mentioned something about a homeowners association, but it seemed like background noise compared to the excitement of finally holding house keys in her hands. The monthly fees were reasonable, she was told, and the neighborhood was well maintained. What more could she want? Sarah moved in on a Saturday in March, boxes stacked in the garage, her mother helping her hang pictures while her 8-year-old daughter Emma explored every closet and corner with the wonder of a child who'd never lived anywhere that wasn't an apartment. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt like she'd made it. She had a mortgage instead of rent, a yard instead of a balcony, and neighbors who smiled and waved when she walked to the mailbox. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under her door while she was at work. It was typed on official letterhead from the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association, signed by Margaret Thornfield, compliance officer. The letter was polite but firm, informing Sarah that her garden gnome violated Section 4.12 of the community guidelines regarding decorative lawn ornaments. She had 7 days to remove it or face escalating fines. Sarah read the letter twice, certain it was a joke. The gnome had been a housewarming gift from her neighbor Mrs. Chun, who'd lived in the community for 15 years. It was 6 inches tall, painted bright red, and sitting cheerfully next to her front steps. She'd seen similar decorations in other yards during her evening walks. How could something so small be a violation? The next morning, she walked through the neighborhood with fresh eyes. Every house looked almost identical. The same beige and white color schemes, the same approved shrubs, the same standard mailboxes. Even the seasonal decorations followed an invisible pattern she was only now beginning to notice. It was beautiful in a sterile way, like a movie set designed to represent suburban perfection. Sarah knocked on Mrs. Chin's door that evening, letter in hand. The older woman's face fell when she saw the citation. She invited Sarah in for tea and explained quietly that she'd received similar letters in the past. The trick, she said, was to comply quickly and quietly. Fighting the HOA never ended well for anyone. But Sarah had spent too many years being told what she couldn't do, couldn't afford, couldn't dream of. She'd worked too hard for this house to let someone else dictate how she lived in it. The gnome stayed. The second letter arrived with a late fee attached. $50 for noncompliance, plus a warning that continued violations would result in a lien against her property. Sarah called the number on the letterhead and reached a voicemail system that transferred her between departments until she hung up in frustration. When she finally reached a human being, The woman on the phone spoke in practiced corporate phrases about community standards and property values. Margaret Thornfield appeared at Sarah's door on a Thursday evening, arriving without notice while Sarah was helping Emma with homework. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to catalog every imperfection in Sarah's front yard. She introduced herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed and explained that the gnome was just the beginning. Sarah's front door was painted forest green, which violated the approved color palette. Her mailbox post needed to be replaced with the standard black metal version. The wildflowers she'd planted along the walkway were not on the approved plant list. The small wind chimes hanging from her porch were classified as noise violations. Margaret spoke as if she were doing Sarah a favor by pointing out these infractions before they became official citations. Sarah stood in her doorway, Emma peeking around her legs, and felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't about community standards or property values. This was about control. About someone who'd never worked 3 jobs or saved for 7 years deciding that Sarah's version of home wasn't good enough for their neighborhood. The violations began arriving weekly. Sarah's trash can was visible from the street on non-collection days. Her car was parked too close to the street lamp. The small American flag she'd hung by her front door was not regulation size. Each letter came with escalating fines, late fees, and increasingly threatening language about legal action. Sarah researched her options and discovered that the HOA had broad legal powers. They could place liens on her property, foreclose on her home, and even garnish her wages for unpaid fines. The community guidelines she'd barely glanced at during closing were legally binding, and she'd signed away more rights than she'd realized. Other neighbors began to avoid her. Mrs. Chen stopped waving during evening walks. The young couple next door hurried inside when they saw her in the yard. Sarah realized that her resistance was making people nervous, reminding them of battles they'd chosen not to fight. The fines reached $800. Sarah's savings account, already depleted from the home purchase, couldn't absorb the mounting penalties. She took on weekend shifts at a retail store, working 7 days a week to pay for the privilege of being told how to live in her own home. Emma began spending more time at her grandmother's house, sensing the stress that had invaded their new sanctuary. Margaret Thornfield seemed to take personal satisfaction in Sarah's struggle. She appeared at unexpected times, photographing violations with a tablet, speaking to neighbors who might be enabling Sarah's defiance. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd found a worthy opponent and was enjoying the process of breaking them down. Sarah's breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon when she found Margaret in her backyard, measuring the height of her fence with a tape measure. The woman explained calmly that she was conducting a routine inspection and that Sarah's fence exceeded the maximum height by 2 inches. The entire structure would need to be rebuilt or face daily fines until compliance was achieved. Standing in her own backyard, watching a stranger document her property like a crime scene, Sarah felt the last of her patience dissolve. She'd spent her life following rules, working within systems, believing that compliance would eventually lead to acceptance. But some battles couldn't be won through submission. What Margaret Thornfield didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had spent the previous 15 years working in the school district's administrative office, where she'd learned to navigate bureaucracy, read legal documents, and most importantly, how to research public records. While Margaret was busy documenting violations, Sarah was spending her lunch breaks at the county courthouse, digging through incorporation documents, financial records, and legal filings. The Maplewood Heights HOA was a corporation, which meant it had to follow corporate law. Sarah discovered that the board meetings mentioned in the community guidelines had been closed to residents for over 3 years. The financial statements that should have been available for review were mysteriously missing from the management company's files. Most interesting of all, Margaret Thornfield's salary had increased by 40% in the past 2 years, funded entirely by violation fines and late fees. Sarah's research revealed a pattern that went far beyond overzealous enforcement. The HOA was systematically targeting newer residents, particularly those who seemed less likely to fight back. Families with children, single parents, elderly residents on fixed incomes all received higher rates of violations than long-term residents who'd learned to stay invisible. The most damning discovery came from mortgage records. 3 families had lost their homes to HOA foreclosure in the past 18 months, all over disputes that began with minor violations and escalated through the same pattern of fines and fees. The properties had been sold at auction for prices well below market value, with the HOA receiving substantial settlement amounts that never appeared in any public financial records. Sarah printed every document, organized them by date and violation type, and began reaching out to other residents who'd received citations. What she found was a community living in quiet fear, paying whatever fines were demanded rather than risk losing their homes. The system worked because it was designed to isolate people, to make them feel like their problems were personal failures rather than symptoms of a larger abuse of power. But Sarah had learned something important during her years in the school district. Bureaucracies depended on people's willingness to accept their authority without question. The moment someone started asking the right questions, demanding transparency, insisting on following proper procedures, the entire system became vulnerable. Sarah's first step was to request a formal hearing regarding her violations, as guaranteed by the community guidelines. When Margaret tried to schedule a closed session with just the two of them, Sarah insisted on her right to a full board hearing with proper notice to all residents. When Margaret claimed such procedures weren't necessary for minor violations, Sarah presented the exact bylaw requiring formal hearings for any fine exceeding $200. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the community center, a sterile room that hadn't been used for its intended purpose in years. Margaret arrived with a stack of violation photos and a confident smile, expecting to face a defeated woman ready to accept whatever penalties were deemed appropriate. Instead, Sarah arrived with 3 boxes of documents, a PowerPoint presentation, and 12 other residents who'd finally found the courage to speak up. She'd also sent a formal invitation to the entire neighborhood, citing the transparency requirements buried in the original incorporation documents. The room filled with people who'd been silent for years, watching their neighbors disappear one by one, wondering when their turn would come. Sarah stood at the front of the room, no longer the overwhelmed single mother who'd been intimidated by official letterhead and corporate authority. She was someone who'd done her homework and was ready to present her case. Margaret's confident smile faltered when Sarah began presenting financial records showing the misappropriation of funds. It disappeared entirely when Sarah revealed the systematic targeting of vulnerable residents and the illegal closed meetings that had been conducted without proper notice or transparency. The revelation that shattered Margaret's authority came when Sarah presented the mortgage records showing how the HOA had profited from foreclosures while claiming to protect property values. The room erupted in angry voices as residents realized they'd been living under a system designed to extract money from their community rather than serve it. Margaret Thornfield, who'd spent years wielding the HOA guidelines like a weapon, found herself facing a room full of people who were no longer afraid. Her authority dissolved in the face of documented evidence and collective outrage. The compliance officer who'd seemed so powerful when targeting isolated individuals suddenly looked very small when confronted by an organized community. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was thorough. Margaret Thornfield resigned within 2 weeks, citing personal reasons that everyone understood meant she'd lost the support of the community she'd terrorized. The HOA board was restructured with new elections, proper transparency requirements, and oversight mechanisms that prevented any single person from wielding unchecked authority. Sarah's violations were dismissed, along with the fines and fees that had been accumulating. More importantly, the community guidelines were revised to focus on actual maintenance and safety issues rather than the aesthetic micromanagement that had made everyone's lives miserable. The approved plant list was expanded to include native species, decorative restrictions were loosened, and the enforcement process was reformed to emphasize education over punishment. The 3 families who'd lost their homes received settlements from the HOA's reserve fund, though nothing could fully compensate for the trauma of losing their houses. The community established a hardship fund to help residents facing financial difficulties rather than pushing them toward foreclosure. Sarah's house became a symbol of successful resistance. Her red front door, her garden gnome, and her wildflowers remained exactly where she'd placed them, no longer violations but reminders that home ownership meant the right to express yourself in your own space. Emma grew up understanding that sometimes standing up for what's right requires courage, research, and the willingness to organize with others who share your values. The story spread beyond Maplewood Heights. Other communities dealing with overreaching HOAs reached out to Sarah for advice on challenging systemic abuse. She developed a guide for residents facing similar situations, emphasizing the importance of documentation, legal research, and community organizing. Margaret Thornfield found work with another management company in a different state, but her reputation followed her. The culture of fear and compliance she'd cultivated was replaced by one of mutual respect and genuine community building. Neighbors began talking to each other again, sharing resources, and working together to maintain their community without sacrificing their individuality. Sarah never stopped working in the school district, but she also became an advocate for homeowners' rights, speaking at city council meetings and helping to pass local ordinances that required greater transparency and accountability from HOAs. Her experience taught her that the American dream wasn't about owning a house that looked like everyone else's, but about having the freedom to make your home reflect your values and personality. The garden gnome still sits by Sarah's front steps, a 6-inch symbol of the power of one person to challenge an entire system. Emma, now in high school, brings friends over who admire the colorful front yard and the house that stands out from its neighbors in all the right ways. They don't know the full story behind the decorations, but they sense that this is a home where people are free to be themselves. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not on distant battlefields, but in suburban driveways, not against foreign enemies, but against the small tyrants who mistake authority for righteousness. Sarah Martinez learned that the American dream doesn't come with strings attached unless you allow others to tie them. Her house represents something more valuable than property values or community standards. It represents the right to call a place home without asking permission from those who've forgotten what home actually means. The community that once lived in fear of violation notices now thrives with the understanding that true property values come from neighborhoods where people want to live, not places where they're afraid to express themselves. Margaret Thornfield's reign of compliance is remembered as a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked and communities forget that they're made up of individuals with rights, dreams, and the courage to defend both. Sarah's story continues every day in the form of neighbors who smile and wave, children who play in yards decorated with personality instead of regulation, and a community that learned the difference between maintaining standards and crushing spirits. The HOA still exists, but it serves the residents rather than ruling them, protecting property values by creating a place where people actually want to live. This story was brought to you by the Human Stories. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else for standing up against a system that seemed impossible to challenge? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their courage inspired others to find their own voice. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.